They handed me the box at 4:20 p.m. No warning, no explanation. Just a knock on the glass. A voice like static. "Claudia, can you step into Conference B?" I thought it was a design sync, maybe a licensing question, something routine. But when I walked in and saw the HR rep already seated, her posture stiff, palms flat, I knew. It wasn't a meeting, it was an execution. 11 years, gone in 6 minutes. They called it realignment. They used words like forward-looking and streamlining. I sat there frozen, trying to understand if this was real, if I had somehow misheard them. But their faces told me I hadn't. I kept waiting for someone to stop it, for someone to say, "Hold on, she built the core infrastructure." No one did. Instead, a man in a charcoal suit leaned in, slid a single document across the table, and said, "Your departure is effective immediately. Please collect your belongings." That man was Declan Maris, CEO of Helix Corp, and once, the man who used to bring me coffee with a shy smile and say, "One day, we'll run this place together." We had met in the early days, two engineers too stubborn to sleep and too ambitious to stop. I helped him prep for his first pitch. He helped me code through 3 nights straight. Then he left for grad school, and I stayed to build the thing we once dreamed about. Now he was back, and I was out. The twist wasn't just that I was being fired, it was who was doing it, and how perfectly rehearsed it all felt. Declan didn't flinch. He didn't look at me. He didn't even say my name, like I was a line of code he had finally deleted. I took the box, walked past the desks I helped design, past the digital wall still flashing my architecture, past the patents still bearing my name. My fingertips were numb, my ears rang. How do you process being erased while the system you built keeps running? Answer, you don't. You just keep walking. And somewhere deep down, you start remembering exactly what you didn't give them. The strange thing about shock is how quiet it is. The body absorbs it like static, a low, humming nothingness. But pride finds its way through the cracks, especially bitter pride. As I sat in the back of that rideshare, clutching the box they'd handed me just minutes earlier, my mind didn't rage. It wandered, not to the betrayal, not to Declan's hollow eyes, but to the first line of code I ever wrote for them. Back when Helix Corp wasn't a global tech giant, but a folding table and a whiteboard in a rented WeWork in Palo Alto. Back when I was just Claudia, the kid from the University of Michigan, who could outcode anyone in the building, but still second-guessed every idea she spoke aloud. I remember the day I stayed until 3:15 a.m., alone with nothing but cold pizza and a blank terminal. I wasn't even supposed to be on the architecture team. I was just helping a senior dev clean up a build. That night, I rewrote the entire licensing module, not because I was asked, but because the way they designed it was insecure, sloppy, vulnerable. The next morning, they made me lead. From there, I didn't just contribute. I shaped the licensing framework from the ground up, drafted the logic trees, wrote the encryption rules, even flew to Geneva to consult on international compliance. What Helix Corp built its empire on, the seamless, cross-border IP licensing of medical AI, was born out of my sleepless nights. My obsessive detail, my unwillingness to let a single line of logic sit unresolved. They called me the licensing architect. But what they never knew, or never bothered to ask, was just how much I had hard-coded myself into the system. The deeper our reach became, as countries began adopting our diagnostics suite and pushing for contracts, the more nervous I became. Not about failure, but about power. How easily a system like ours could be abused once it scaled. How vulnerable the creators became once the thing ran without them. That's when I drafted Clause 7.4, a quiet little paragraph buried deep in the International Patent Protocol. It required dual authorization for any cross-border licensing, one from the company, One from the original architect listed on the patent. No one questioned it. Legal filed it. Product ignored it. The investors thought it sounded impressive, so they let it through. I didn't write it for them. I wrote it for me. A parachute, a key, a way back in, or a way out. If it ever came to that. Back then. I hoped I'd never need it. Now, sitting in the back of that car, watching the sun set behind the Helix Core campus, I realized something brutal. They didn't just fire an employee. They tried to erase the very architect of the empire they were still profiting from, and they thought I would go quietly. They forgot I still had the keys, and the system? It didn't belong to them. It belonged to the one who built it. The moment I saw Declan Maris at the end of that conference table, I felt something twist deep inside me, not rage, not fear, not even betrayal. It was something quieter, older, a bruise that had never fully healed. 6 years ago, he wasn't a CEO, he was just another engineer. 2 rows over, always scribbling equations in the margins of his notepad, like he was afraid to lose a thought. He had a nervous laugh and a terrible habit of interrupting himself mid-sentence, but he was brilliant. And he noticed me long before anyone else did. We weren't some tragic office romance. It wasn't messy. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, it was clean, efficient. At first, we bonded over algorithms and 2:00 a.m. debugging marathons. He'd bring me coffee without asking. I'd bring him ramen when he forgot to eat. We started dating after a weekend retreat to Tahoe with the team. Stayed up on the deck until sunrise, talking about what we'd build if we had the freedom. He talked about leadership. I talked about security, looking back. Maybe that should have told me everything. But I loved him. In the steady, quiet way people love when they still believe work and relationships can coexist without burning each other down. He used to call me the anchor, said I kept him grounded when his mind got ahead of itself. But eventually, that became the problem. You don't think big enough. Claudia, he once told me, pacing in my apartment, gesturing with both hands like the room couldn't contain his vision. You're too careful, too married to the code. That was the night he told me he'd been offered a full-ride MBA program, fast-track executive training, and he was taking it. He kissed me once on the forehead and left before 6:00 a.m. He didn't say goodbye, not properly. I stayed. I kept building. I thought that was the right thing to do. Build slow, build right. When he came back 2 years later, freshly groomed, tailored suits, and a new vocabulary of venture speak and leadership buzzwords, I hardly recognized him. He didn't reach out. He didn't even look at me during meetings. I assumed he was just different now, disconnected, a memory pretending it never happened. But after I was let go, I found something. In a public investor deck from 3 years earlier, the one that had apparently secured Helix Core's Series D round and ultimately elevated Declan to CEO, I saw a slide titled Unified Licensing Security, the Future of Medical AI Compliance. And beneath it, the exact architecture I'd proposed in an internal white paper, a white paper I had only ever shared with 2 people. Declan was one of them. I stared at the slide for hours, heart pounding like I'd been physically struck. I remembered the late nights working on it, the phrasing I used, the diagrams. Even the examples were the same. He hadn't just moved on. He had used me, leveraged my work to gain trust, funding, and eventually the throne he now used to cast me out. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. And the worst part? It worked. I wish I could say I cried, that I screamed, that I broke something, but I didn't. I sat there, completely still, feeling something inside me collapse with eerie quiet, like an old bridge giving way under invisible pressure, not suddenly, but inevitably. I had loved a man who saw me as a stepping stone, who mistook my caution for smallness, who mistook my loyalty for weakness. And now, he sat in a glass office, 5 floors above where I once stood, firing the woman whose vision had funded his entire career. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from watching someone rise using the wings you built, only to clip yours when you try to fly. I wasn't done hurting, not yet. But I knew one thing for sure. He thought he'd finished writing my ending. What he didn't know was that I had already written the next chapter. Looking back, the trap wasn't set the day they fired me. It was set 6 months earlier. The moment Declan sent me that document, a single PDF attachment in an email so casual it almost slipped past my defenses. "Hey, Claudia, legal's doing a cleanup of old IP filings. Just a formality. Mind giving this a quick signature when you get the chance?" The tone was deliberate. No urgency, no red flags. Just another procedural update, like hundreds I'd reviewed over the years. Most engineers would have opened it, skimmed the first page, and signed. But I wasn't most engineers, and I knew Declan too well, especially after what happened between us. So I did what I always do when something feels too easy. I printed it, sat down with a highlighter, and read every single line. At first glance, it seemed harmless, a reorganization of Helix Corp's intellectual property holdings. But on page 7, buried in the middle of a paragraph under international licensing clauses, I spotted the change. They'd replaced the dual authorization clause, my clause, with a new provision that centralized all global licensing power under corporate executive authority. No more secondary sign-offs, no more checks, no more me. It wasn't just a refile. It was a transfer of power, a silent erasure, and Declan had sent it like it was nothing. I could have confronted him. I could have stormed into his office and demanded to know what he was doing, but I didn't. I knew Declan. I knew confrontation was what he expected, something he could manipulate or dismiss as emotional noise. Instead, I got quiet. I got surgical. I accessed the IP registrar portal. Quietly, legally. I ran a full check on the patent's metadata, license trails, country-by-country status. Everything looked correct. Except for one thing. The official International License Protocol, the version filed with the World Intellectual Property Organization, still listed me as primary licensing authority across 38 countries. They hadn't updated it yet. The only way to finalize the change was to submit my signature on the international clause override. And that, I never gave them. Instead, I made a copy of the document Declan sent. Then I made a second version, a domestic-only update, retaining U.S. compliance revisions, but leaving international protocols untouched. I signed that one. Then I uploaded it to legal with the subject line, "Domestic Patent Streamlining, Completed." They filed it without question. It was just close enough to the version they'd wanted, enough to convince them the job was done. And I kept the real one, unsigned, offline, dated, safe. The following week, a junior legal associate named Priya stopped me in the elevator. She was new, sharp, still full of caffeine and hope. "Hey, Claudia," she said with a bright smile. "Thanks for turning around that IP form so fast. Declan was really happy with it." I smiled politely, nodded once. But inside, I filed that moment away like a timestamp. The day they thought they erased me, and the day I started preparing for the possibility that they just might try. From that point forward, I worked differently. I documented everything. I saved emails. I backed up logs on a private drive. I watched Declan's moves, not through confrontation, but through code. And every time he smiled too easily in a meeting, or CC'd me on a task I'd already completed, or brought in another strategic advisor to modernize the platform, I took note, not out of paranoia, out of certainty. He was laying the groundwork for something. I didn't know if it would be 6 weeks or 6 months, but I knew it was coming. And when it did, when the knife finally landed, I wanted to make sure I still held the only pen that mattered, the one I never used, the one they forgot I still owned. The first time I saw her, She was standing in front of the whiteboard in Lab 3, drawing the exact same licensing flow I'd designed 3 years prior, with only half the precision and none of the ownership. A name tag on her badge read, Elena Sharp, Systems Architect 2. She couldn't have been more than 27. Bright, eager, fresh from MIT, with that wide-eyed look of someone who still believed every all-hands meeting mattered, and every tech CEO had a soul. But what made my stomach turn wasn't her confidence. It was the eerie familiarity. The way she talked about scalability. The way she referenced the modular integrity of the framework. Phrases I coined, concepts I refined. She didn't just admire my work. She'd been trained to mirror me. I found out 2 days later, through a departmental email with the subject line, New lead transition for Phase 2. I wasn't CC'd. A colleague discreetly forwarded it to me. Inside was a photo of Elena with a blurb that read, Elena brings fresh vision and energy to our legacy architecture. Under her leadership, Phase 2 will be more agile, future-forward, and innovation-driven. That last line burned. Legacy architecture. That was me. That was my system. That was my identity, reduced to a footnote. And the worst part? They didn't fire me, they reassigned me. We really value your expertise, Claudia, Declan had said, not meeting my eyes in the meeting room 2 floors below his office. We see this as a shift toward thought leadership, a chance for you to mentor the next generation and focus on big-picture strategy. I was given a new title, Strategic Technical Advisor, Emeritus. A desk near the back hallway, no team, no active projects, and no more roadmap meetings. It wasn't a promotion, it was a slow burial. At first, I told myself it was temporary, a reshuffle, a political compromise, something I'd rise above. I showed up, answered questions when asked, sat quietly through meetings I used to lead. But then the permissions started slipping. Quietly, systematically. I lost access to the dev environment, then the API logs, then version control history. When I brought it up to IT, they brushed it off. New compliance protocol, should be temporary. But I knew better. Then, Priya, the sharp junior associate from legal, sent me a message one evening. Just one sentence. Check the footnotes on Memo 12.4. They changed your clearance tier. My hands trembled as I opened the internal file directory. Memo 12.4 was buried in a shared drive most engineers never touched. Inside, hidden in the appendix, was a quiet note. Strategic Technical Advisor role to be classified Tier 3, view only. Phase out of elevated credentials to be completed within 90 days. They hadn't just replaced me. They were dismantling me, line by line, access by access, until I became nothing but a name on a shelf. I stared at the screen for a long time that night, lit only by the blue glow of a system I once commanded. Elena didn't know. She wasn't the villain. She was just the latest recruit, the new vessel, but she would never be me. I didn't build Helix Core by being flashy or loud. I built it through discipline, through obsession, through the kind of quiet genius that didn't need applause. But now, that discipline, that silence, was being used to erase me. They thought if they gave me a dignified title and a soft chair in the corner, I'd nod politely and fade away. They didn't realize I had built this system not just with code, but with foresight, with safeguards, with triggers. And somewhere deep inside that code was something only I could unlock. Or freeze. Let them think I was obsolete. Let them believe they'd replaced me. The version of me they thought they'd erased? She was still here, and she was just getting started. No one said goodbye. There was no farewell cake, no group photo, no quiet hallway hug from the people I used to call my team. I left in silence. Just another chair that wouldn't be filled. Just another name quietly removed from a Slack channel no one checked. It was 6:50 p.m. when I returned to my desk one last time. The lights had gone into power-saving mode. casting the entire floor in a pale, ghostly hue. It made the place look abandoned. In a way. Maybe it was. I sat down, slowly. My fingers brushed across the edges of the keyboard, the same one I'd worn smooth coding the first prototype of our cross-border licensing tool. My name was still faintly scratched into the underside of the monitor stand. I'd carved it there during a night I was too tired to think, but too stubborn to quit. I opened the bottom drawer, pulling out the worn black notebook I hadn't touched in nearly 2 years. It was stitched leather, thick with dog-eared pages and faded post-it tabs. Inside were the building blocks of the empire they now claimed as theirs. Architectures, sketches, cipher protocols, and deep in the center, between 2 taped printouts, a single line of code written in red ink. If user primary null force, revoke true disable auth global. It was the heart of the fallback protocol. My failsafe. The system had been built with the assumption that power could be corrupted, that ownership might change hands without consent. So I'd created a kill switch, a piece of logic buried in the infrastructure that could only be triggered under a very specific set of conditions. Forced revocation without mutual transfer. If those flags were ever met, all global licensing requests would auto-fail until reauthorized by the original system architect. Me. I hadn't told anyone, not even the legal team. I'd logged the logic in a side repository under a benign name, RLS Compliance. Backup, View.4. It passed review because no one ever bothered to open the actual function. I logged into my private backup server from my laptop, still miraculously authenticated on the guest Wi-Fi. I navigated the directories slowly, methodically, almost ceremonially. The deeper I went, the more distant I felt from everything else, like I was descending into something ancient, something sacred. And there it was, untouched, unchanged, still bound to my biometric confirmation. I ran a diagnostic script, watching the output scroll line by line until I hit the one I was looking for. Primary deactivation override. False secondary biolock status. Active. Claudia Rains. Revocation, permissions. Restricted to originator in plain English. Even if they found the switch, they couldn't flip it. Not without me. Not ever. I leaned back in the chair, arms folded across my chest, and stared at the ceiling. A low hum vibrated through the air from the nearby server room. Familiar, constant, uncaring. The same hum I used to find comfort in. Now, it felt distant, mechanical, cold. I looked around the space, at the old photos still pinned to my cubicle wall, most of them faded. There was one of me and Declan back in 2017, standing in front of a whiteboard covered in notes, smiling like idiots who thought we had time. We were younger then, hopeful, stupid. I tore the photo off the wall, folded it in half, then folded it again until his face disappeared. People think betrayal is loud, that it comes in slamming doors and angry emails, but this kind of betrayal is silent. It's 1,000 tiny erasures, 1,000 moments where no one fights for you, no one speaks your name, you just vanish, piece by piece, until even your absence is ignored. I held the notebook close and stood. No applause, no warning, no tears, only steel in my spine, and code in my hands. As I stepped out into the elevator alone, I told myself something I needed to believe. They could take my title, they could steal my credit, but they would never take control, because they forgot the one rule that mattered most in every system ever built. You can't overwrite the original without permission, and mine was never given. Vengeance isn't loud. It doesn't come with shattered glass or slamming doors. It's quiet, cold. It's a line of code. Entered once, at 2:42 a.m. That was when I sat down in the living room of my apartment, lit only by the soft, sterile glow of my laptop screen. I hadn't slept in 2 days. I wasn't angry anymore, just sharpened. Precision, not passion, was what would matter now. Earlier that evening, I had triple-checked the fallback protocol. The biometric lock was still active. The code was clean, no alterations. The triggers were still bound to the original system parameters I had written 3 years ago. There was no drama in my decision, no swelling music, just one press of enter. That line was already live, deep inside the architecture, waiting for the exact combination of flags. All I needed to do was flip the external confirmation on my end and make it permanent. I opened the secure access portal, one I'd created during the architecture's alpha stage for exactly this kind of contingency. It was hosted on a private server, separate from Helix Core's mainframe. Back then, we'd laughed about it being prompted for voice confirmation. I spoke one word, confirm, and pressed send. The command was simple. Revoke secondary auth equals true. It propagated quietly through the network's heartbeat. In 30 minutes, Singapore froze. In 2 hours, Paris. By 8:05 a.m., the entire European licensing grid returned errors across every active endpoint. Clients couldn't renew keys. Partners couldn't validate modules. New licenses failed at handshake. Helix Core's prized cross-border system, designed for seamless compliance and real-time authorization, was locked down like a glitching elevator. But it wasn't a glitch. It was a decision. Mine. By 10 o'clock a.m., my phone lit up with 3 missed calls from unknown numbers. A fourth came in, Japanese country code. I let it ring, then let it go. A minute later, a single email appeared in my inbox. From a man I respected, a man who had been one of Helix Core's earliest international clients. Subject line, straight question message. Did you do this? I stared at those 4 words for a long time. There was no anger in his tone, no accusation, just clarity. He knew. They all did. Not officially, not yet. But somewhere in their gut, they understood. The system was never built to function without me, not completely. And now, the world was seeing that. Back at Helix Core headquarters, I imagined Declan's face, not out of cruelty, out of curiosity. Was he sweating, calling legal, barking orders into a speakerphone? I wondered how long it would take him to realize the truth, that the woman he dismissed as outdated still controlled the most vital artery of the company's global infrastructure. I wondered if he would remember that day in 2018 when I warned him, in the quietest voice. Any system built without fail-safes will eventually fail safely for someone else. I didn't reply to the email. There was no need. The freeze spoke for itself. In this kind of war, silence is more powerful than any declaration. It doesn't beg for acknowledgement. It forces it. I shut the laptop gently. No drama, no applause. Outside, the city was just waking up. Lights flicked on in the apartment across the street. A delivery truck rumbled down the avenue. Life went on, calm, indifferent. But in boardrooms across 3 continents, everything had just stopped. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled. They had erased me from the room. But now, the entire world could feel the space I used to fill. There's a particular kind of silence that only comes when the storm is not over, but already doing its work. I sat at my small kitchen table, wrapped in a soft gray sweater, sipping lukewarm tea while the world spun in chaos. Helix Core was burning, and all I did was watch. By 8:15 a.m., just under 24 hours after the freeze, the headlines began circulating across financial feeds. Critical licensing outage, halts, international operations at Helix Core, 280 mailers and contracts on hold pending verification of IP ownership. The Helix freeze, system glitch or legal landmine. I didn't need to search for the articles. They arrived on their own, emailed to me by former colleagues, whispered in private LinkedIn messages, even texted from an old software vendor who never forgot how I helped him fix a corrupted database back in 2019. I didn't respond to anyone. I didn't need to. The code was doing the talking now. By day 2, a wave of investor calls hit Helix Core's board. Shareholders weren't angry yet. They were confused, demanding clarity, asking for statements, legal proof, anything. The execs scrambled. And Declan, so smooth, so prepared, was, for once, cornered. What could he say? He couldn't reveal that the woman he had fired still held a legal chokehold on global operations. He couldn't admit they'd failed to obtain secondary authorization before terminating me. That would cause even more panic. Instead, he called it a temporary back-end misfire, a minor outage, but the market didn't believe him. On day 3, the first domino fell. A $90 million contract with a government-backed research institution in Belgium was formally withdrawn. Not suspended, canceled. The reason? Unresolved compliance ambiguity and unknown third-party authorization control. That was the language they used, but what they meant was, we don't know who really owns this system. It was enough to make others flinch. By day 4, the losses reached $480 million. Declan's carefully built investor circle was unraveling. The man who once spoke about vision over caution was now fielding calls from people who wanted his resignation, or at least, a sacrificial lamb. I sat quietly through it all. No celebration, no revenge monologue, just silence. Not out of modesty, out of design. Letting them collapse without interference was the most powerful statement I could make. If I had spoken up, it would have been petty. If I had gloated, they'd spin it as vindictive. But silence, that was unshakable. It forced people to ask harder questions. And they did. Around 5:40 p.m. on the 4th day. My phone buzzed with a contact I hadn't seen in years. Grant Wickley, senior partner at Vesper Capital. One of the earliest investors Helix Core had chased aggressively during our Series B round. I remembered him well. He was charming, smug, and dismissive, the kind of man who once told me in a boardroom, "Engineers make great builders, Claudia, but rarely good decision-makers." I had smiled politely that day, said nothing. Now, years later, he was calling me. I let it ring twice, then answered, calm and even. "Claudia Rains." "Ms. Rains," he said, clearing his throat. "I believe we may have misjudged the strategic importance of your position. I was wondering if you'd be willing to consult, off the record, of course, on how to stabilize investor confidence." There it was. Not an apology, not quite. But close enough. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just leaned back in my chair and stared out the window as dusk crept over the skyline. "I'll think about it," I said. "After all, trust is a tricky thing once it's broken." He paused, then gave a clipped, "understood," and the call ended. I closed my eyes, letting the stillness settle. My heartbeat was calm, steady, no rage, no adrenaline, just the quiet knowledge that they had finally realized the truth. I hadn't destroyed Helix Core. They had. I simply stopped protecting it. And now, they finally understood what happens when you erase the architect and forget who designed the foundation. The call came in at 9:27 a.m. I was sitting in a small coffee shop on the corner of Fillmore and Hayes. My laptop closed, a paperback novel half read beside my cup. It was a gray San Francisco morning, damp, windless, indifferent. Exactly the kind of morning where nothing feels urgent unless you're the one drowning. I didn't recognize the number, but I didn't need to. The moment it rang, I knew. I let it go to voicemail, twice, on the third try. I picked up, slowly, deliberately, then said nothing. Just let the silence breathe. "Claudia?" His voice was different, hoarse, slower. I'd heard it confident, amused, dismissive. But now it was hesitant, measured. I didn't answer. It's Declan. Look, I know you don't owe me anything, but Helix Corps, we need your help. Still, I said nothing. There was a beat of dead air, long enough to make him uncomfortable. We've hit a legal wall, he continued. International licensing protocols are locked. The compliance team traced it back to the fallback you wrote, Clause 7.4. I could hear him shifting in his chair, papers rustling, maybe a board member pacing behind him. We need your signature, Claudia, to reauthorize global access, temporarily, just until we sort this out. There it was, the ask. The desperation was thick in his voice now, like someone pleading for air. And it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded real. A CEO on the edge of watching his empire unravel, begging the one person he believed he could erase. I looked out the window at a man walking his dog across the street. He looked peaceful, grounded, completely disconnected from this war playing out in tech headlines and panicked investor calls. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet. I wanted him to lean in, to feel every word. I gave you my signature once, I said. You erased it. He exhaled, soft and broken, as if he'd hoped that wasn't the line I'd say, but knew it was coming. Claudia, I didn't mean for it to go this way. I cut him off. You meant for it to go exactly this way. You thought you could cut the architect out of the blueprint and still build the same structure. Another pause. I imagined him sitting in his office, his once pristine desk cluttered with legal briefs, PR drafts, and unread Slack threads, his suit jacket probably draped over the back of the chair, his hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it one too many times. Then what do you want? He finally asked. Money? Equity? A new title? That made me laugh. A low, bitter chuckle I hadn't planned. You still think this is about getting something back, I said. It's not. He stayed silent. Good. He was finally learning. What I want, I continued, is for you to sit in that boardroom and explain to your investors how the woman you pushed out without a second thought still holds the key to your survival and chooses not to turn it. His voice cracked slightly. This could ruin us. No, Declan, I replied, calm and cold. You already did that. I'm just not stopping it. I hung up. No final jab. No dramatic monologue. Just a clean click and the return of soft jazz over the cafe speakers. 10 minutes later, I got an email from HR, clearly automated and a few days too late. As part of our offboarding process, please remember to return all company-issued materials. I smirked and deleted it. They were still trying to close doors that no longer existed. That afternoon, I walked along the marina, watching sailboats drift like ghosts against the fog. My phone stayed silent. No more calls, no more pleading, and for the first time in weeks, I felt nothing. No anger, no triumph, just a clean, cold clarity. They had asked for my help. I gave them my silence instead. And in that silence, they heard everything. Rebirth isn't always loud, sometimes. It doesn't come with champagne, applause, or a glossy launch video with inspirational music. Sometimes, it comes with an EIN number, a leased floor in a modest building, and a battered leather notebook full of code scribbled in coffee shops and insomnia. Rain's licensing systems was officially incorporated at 9:58 a.m. on a Thursday. No fanfare. Just a digital confirmation and a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying sliding off my shoulders. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about proving something anymore. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine. Authorship, ownership, control. By the time I signed the first contract, the frostbite from the Helix freeze had turned into full-blown hemorrhaging. A major European health tech consortium, one that had been with Helix Corps for 6 years, terminated their relationship and contacted me directly. They didn't need theatrics, Just one sentence sealed it. We want to work with the person who built the system, not the ones who gutted it. The contract was worth $190 million over 3 years, covering exclusive licensing access, infrastructure migration, and long-term consultation. I read the final agreement twice before signing. I didn't celebrate. I simply closed the folder, looked out the window of my small new office, and breathed for the first time in what felt like months. The office wasn't much, a 2,000-square-foot space above a printing company in Mission Bay, with peeling paint in the stairwell and a humming AC unit that clicked every 10 minutes. But it was mine. And slowly, it began to fill with life again. First came Mira, my former compliance lead at Helix Core, let go during Declan's so-called efficiency realignment. She showed up with a backpack, a binder of international IP laws, and a crooked smile. "I always said the soul of that company lived in your flowcharts," she told me on day 1. "I'm here to help build the next one." Next came Alex, a back-end engineer I trained 5 years ago. Quiet, methodical, and criminally underutilized at Helix Core. Declan had deemed him non-essential. Alex walked into my new office with a flash drive, a personal server image, and a small cactus he named Firewall. And finally, Devin, my former junior analyst, barely 26, fired after he challenged a cost-cutting decision that compromised licensing integrity. He showed up with nothing but questions, fire in his eyes, and the kind of loyalty you only get when someone's seen the worst of the system and still believes in building better. I didn't need to give them titles. They gave themselves purpose. We didn't move fast. We moved right. Our system wasn't just a clone of what I'd built at Helix Core. It was a reimagining. Smarter. Lighter. More ethical. Every licensing agreement included a human review clause. Every encryption protocol came with an opt-out kill switch for clients. Every line of code was reviewed not just for speed, but for soul. We weren't just building software. We were rebuilding trust. The press didn't understand it at first. They called it a splinter firm, a rogue spin-off. But clients? They understood immediately. Within 6 weeks, we had inquiries from 7 countries. 3 former Helix Core clients requested exploratory meetings. A data security firm in Zurich offered to host our cloud expansion. Even a university in Singapore asked if we could build a training pipeline for young engineers to learn from the person who created modern international IP architecture. It was humbling, and it was just the beginning. One afternoon, as we hung the new sign on our office door, a simple frosted glass with black lettering, Mira turned to me and asked, "Do you feel like you've won?" I paused, genuinely thinking it over. "No," I said. "I feel like I finally started." And it was true. Because winning implies the end of a game. But this? This was a new rule book, one I'd written by surviving the old one. Declan had fired me thinking he'd buried the past. But he didn't realize he wasn't burying legacy. He was fertilizing something future-proof. And now, I wasn't just back. I was building an empire where I would never need anyone's permission again. It took 3 months and 12 days. That's how long it took for the cracks to become canyons, for whispers to become headlines, and for what started as a quiet freeze to evolve into a full-blown corporate collapse. Helix Core lost 68% of its international market share by the end of the fiscal quarter. What remained was a skeleton crew managing patchwork licensing deals that barely held legal ground. The systems weren't broken. They were hollow, stalled, outdated, built on stolen scaffolding that no longer stood. And it was no longer just a business issue. It had become a scandal. It started with a leak, an anonymous internal memo sent to 2 journalists at the Ledger Tech Review. The memo was dry on the surface, full of compliance jargon and internal audit language, but it contained something explosive. A detailed timeline of how Helix Core's executive team had knowingly pushed out their lead architect without completing the international transfer of IP authorization. Even worse, it included meeting notes that exposed the conversations behind closed doors. In one, Declan reportedly told legal, "She's legacy. We'll phase her out quietly. Worst case, we rewrite the back end and bury the rest under new branding." The memo was signed anonymously, but I recognized the phrasing. Mira had always been a master of subtle rebellion. The article broke on a Wednesday. The next morning, every major tech outlet had picked it up. Headlines screamed across news feeds. Helix core implosion. Architect ousted without legal transfer of IP. Executive sabotage. CEO Declan Maris under fire for cover-up. Licensing giant facing regulatory sanctions after internal memo leak. I didn't comment. I didn't retweet. I didn't answer my phone. I simply sat in the glass-walled conference room of Rain's licensing systems, watching Mira, Alex, and Devon onboard a new client from Geneva, one of the very accounts that had once fed Helix Core's global revenue. But they weren't the only ones watching. That Friday, Helix Core's board convened an emergency session. The Zoom room included executives, investors, and outside legal counsel. One board member, who had been skeptical of Declan from the beginning, reportedly opened the call with a simple sentence: "We've lost the room, and we all know why." Declan tried to defend himself. Sources later told me he called the memo manipulated, accused former employees of sabotage, and claimed the system collapse was a confluence of operational delays, not individual decisions. But the data didn't lie. The contracts didn't lie. And most damning of all, the system logs showed the fallback protocol had been live for 3 years, and untouched until the day I left. There were no technical oversights, just arrogance. By 4:00 p.m., the board voted to indefinitely suspend Declan Maris as CEO, pending a full investigation. The press didn't call it a firing yet, but the headlines were clear. Maris suspended as Helix Core faces downfall tied to licensing collapse. Architect's revenge? Or just justice delivered by the code? I read the news while sitting in the sunroom of my apartment, a mug of tea cooling beside me. I didn't feel joy. Not exactly. It was sharper than joy, colder, cleaner, not because he fell, but because he finally understood why. That evening, Devon walked into my office, holding his tablet. "You see the news?" he asked, eyes lit with vindication. "Yeah," I said softly. "They finally figured out who was holding the blueprint." He smiled and turned to leave, but paused. "You think they'll recover?" I looked out the window at the city, breathing beyond the glass. "Maybe," I said, "but not with the same name, and not with the same lies." This was more than revenge. It was a correction, a realignment of truth. Declan had gambled that removing me would simplify his empire. Instead, it unraveled it, thread by thread. And all I had to do was let the code run its course. I turned down every interview request. They came pouring in after Declan's suspension. Tech podcasts, mainstream media, even a request from a best-selling journalist writing a book on silent power shifts in Silicon Valley. Some offered generous honorariums. Others promised full editorial control or a platform to tell my side. But I didn't need a platform. I already had one, the code. Instead, I spent those weeks quietly. I walked more. I read again. I cooked meals without rushing, for the first time in years. I woke up without a calendar filled with someone else's demands. My days didn't start with fire drills or executive posturing. They started with birdsong and sunlight through the blinds. That was my victory, not the collapse, not the headlines, but the absence of noise. Still, the world kept moving. By mid-January, a coalition of international health and biotech leaders announced a first-of-its-kind licensing summit to build a new open standard IP framework, one focused on cross-border transparency. creator rights, and decentralized integrity. They called it the Geneva Protocols. The irony wasn't lost on me. Geneva was the same city I once walked through alone after Helix Core's first patent filing, feeling like an invisible giant. Now, I was being asked to return, this time not as a ghost in someone else's success, but as a recognized architect. At first, I hesitated. Visibility never interested me, but this wasn't about visibility. It was about stewardship, and perhaps closure. The summit was held in a glass-paneled hall overlooking Lake Geneva. Delegates in tailored suits sipped espresso between sessions. Interpreters murmured quietly in their headsets, and somewhere between the session on blockchain-authenticated royalties and another on ethical automation, a familiar name buzzed through the crowd. Is that Claudia Rains? I didn't wear anything extravagant, just a gray blazer, flat shoes, and the same pen I'd used to sign my first licensing framework 12 years ago. When it came time to sign the new Global Licensing Compact, they offered me the final slot on the dais. My name was embossed on the binder in silver foil, Claudia E. Rains, Architect, RLS. There were flashbulbs, a few camera shutters. I ignored them. I stood, walked to the podium, signed without hesitation. And then, as protocol required, I was asked if I had any closing remarks. I hadn't planned any, but the room quieted. The eyes turned toward me. So I spoke. Not for long, just enough. I built my first licensing protocol with more skepticism than hope. I wasn't trying to control the world. I was trying to protect what mattered in it. Then I got erased from the system I built. But the thing about architecture is, when it's sound, it remembers the hands that built it, even when others forget. And then I paused, looked out over the crowd, dozens of executives, policymakers, engineers, some who knew my story, others who only knew the headlines. Then I ended with 6 simple words. No flourish, no smile. Some systems don't need restarting. That line echoed longer than I expected. Some people stood, others just nodded, slowly, with the understanding only professionals who've been burned before can offer. Later that evening, a young woman, probably in her early 20s, maybe a grad student, found me near the exit. "You didn't say his name," she whispered. "Not once." "I didn't have to," I replied. "This wasn't about him. It never was." Back home, I placed the Geneva pen beside the original Helix Core prototype sketch, the one I'd found in that old black notebook. Next to it, I added a new photo, me, Mira, Alex, and Devin on our office balcony, holding coffee mugs, laughing like the war had never happened, because in a way, it hadn't. It had simply ended, and I didn't win because I fought. I won because I never logged out. I just waited for the system to realize who never left.